In Chattanooga, Tennessee, David Tulis.
It's easy to protest. It's easy to say someone is a hater, someone is wrong. We are against racism. We are against fascism. We're against brutality. We're against oppression. These are, I'm afraid, they're not very useful things to be spending a lot of time discussing. What I'd rather do, is in the time that I have with you, my listener, is to suggest that there are ways of coming to understand people who are different from yourself, who vote differently, right? Who are in the wrong party, right? And to find a way of making these differences less so that we can expand our work here in Chattanooga for the whole, for the better. And that argument, of course, is Noogacentrism, or as I like to call it in a more friendly way, is local economy. Yes, this show is about local economy and the free market. And of course, local economy is highly controversial. It's very, very controversial. Look, I'm so dedicated to local economy that I'm under a ban from the mayor's office, who uses his political friends at the police department to block access to ordinary routine events such as naming of the police chief. You can read about that today at Nooganomics.com. There are things that we need to discuss that are amicable and amity, full of amity, full of you might say family orientation, that I think will be a way of making life better here. And it's not in terms of politics. There are some religious presuppositions behind my proposals, but they, in the end, appeal to humanity and even to humanism, right? Appeal to humanism among people who don't have God's grace to believe in Him, but who nonetheless borrow from Christianity, borrow from the ideas of God's grace, borrow from Christ's sacrifice on the cross, borrow the concept of thinking about others, right? The whole marketplace does that anyway, and they would be doing, in a free market, in a successful free market, people are doing what Christ says to do, even though they don't believe in Him. And that is simply because we're made in God's image, and we have to do things a certain way as human beings. We don't have choices. Just as we don't have a choice of whether our sex is male or female, we don't have a choice on how to succeed. To be successful, whether you believe in the Lord Jesus or not, you have to think about your customer. And that is what local economy explores. My show here, David Tulis at Nooga Radio, I explore how that works. Local economy is about making other people successful. And then, hey, you'll find out as you go, you're successful too. You've got money coming in, you've got a living, you've got enough money to buy a house with a very small mortgage, maybe, right? You've got some savings. And because you've been thinking about other people first, the marketplace requires you to think like a Christian and act like a Christian, though you may not be, right? You may be a Jew. You may be a Hindu. You may be a Muslim. And yet, if you follow Christ's rule of mortifying yourself, mortifying your flesh, thinking of your other person first, you are mimicking what He did for His people, right? You mimic Christ on the cross, dying for His enemies, dying for His people, saving them from eternal damnation, and giving them a light in this life, and that is the law of God, the law which condemns sin and requires goodness in the heart and in external action. As they say, in behavior, right? I don't like the term behavior. I never have liked it because it comes from a scientific school of thought which views men as animals. So I never talk about behavior ever, because it comes from the world of scientific observation, rats. And I'd rather refer to action instead. But anyway, protesting doesn't get you very far, but Christianity does, right? Christianity is taught, even badly in the churches of Chattanooga, even weakly in the churches of Chattanooga, is still better than any alternative system. Any alternative system will only bring disaster. And of course, the weak forms of Christianity have invited disaster and have allowed disaster, and have allowed the non-comment, the no comment on disasters for decades. We do have this problem here in the South, but still, the Word is there, the Bible is there, the books are there to read, the biblical books, right? The 66 books, and there are many worthy commentaries that will help explore what to do. And that's a large body of literature in the Reformed camp, neglected and ignored by probably most evangelical Christians with a Baptistic framework, Baptistic way of thinking, the fundamentalist perspective. Now, just in this topic about protests, there's a story that I wanted to mention in the Christian Post. It's about an Ohio megachurch, and there are some very concerned, very devout Christian men who are protesting outside. They're called the Minutemen and Minutemen United, and they're protesting on the Lord's Day in the front of this church. Now, these men have a right concern. They want the thousands of people who may be attending this worship center, right? This facility, this no doubt a state corporation, want them to get involved in the issues of the day. And these men have been protesting every Sunday morning since October, after months of sit downs and discussions with Vineyard Columbus leadership staff. That has finally come to an end, and the church is asking an injunction against the protesters from keeping them marching near the property. Jim Harrison is part of this group. He says the U.S. is in pretty bad shape, and that to restore the country, the church must be more actively engaged in the cultural war. This group is about sharing the love, hope, and truth of Jesus Christ, regardless of the consequences. Our goal is not to shake the church up, but to get Vineyard Columbus senior pastor Rich Nathan to see what is happening in America, stop being passive, and convince other pastors. This is a quote to the Christian Post newspaper. And the Minutemen have anywhere from 3 to 15 protesters. They're holding signs. These signs say things such as, "Please help us end abortion. Please help us defend marriage." And "Men of God, America needs you now. We are in moral decline, and the Church of Jesus Christ has not been the salt and light in the world that Christ commanded it to be." And this is a protest. Well, I have a question. Okay, well, you're saying this is Sunday morning. Okay, so we're going to save the nation, right? And we're going to do it by protesting on the Lord's Day. Well, the Lord's Day is a day that God reserves for himself, and it's a day of worship. The Sabbath is to be kept holy unto the Lord. When men, according to the Westminster Confession of Faith, after a due preparing of their hearts and ordering of their common affairs beforehand, do not only observe and wholly rest all the day from their works, words, and thoughts about their worldly employments and recreations, but also are taken up the whole time in the public and private exercises of his worship and in the duties of necessity and mercy. So the Lord's Day is a day God reserves to himself. Can we be involved in protest of this kind? Does protest create the right perspective? And my spirit is probably with the Minutemen, and would be sort of saying, we got to get these big church people to do something. But here again, it seems to me that the Minutemen are relying on men to do things, that it's relying on men to accomplish the ending of the abortion trade, for example, in that Ohio town of Columbus, to end the abuse of public school against the soul of every inmate of that school, of those schools. These are reforms against the machine, if you will, against the depersonalism of administrative machinery that is our salvation today. It is a long process to overturn those things, and then often it's not by direct confrontation. It's about going around the flank. It's about outflanking these wicked systems that the left sometimes rightly complains about. The left rightly complains about fascism. We had this event in Chattanooga Thursday that we extensively covered here at Nooganomics and at Nooga Radio, and condemning fascism. Well, fascism ought to be condemned, but the whole system is fascistic, and it's not necessarily a white. It's not to assume it's a white and black form is simply wrong. It's simply you might say partisan way of looking at it. The fascism oppresses everybody. It oppresses every of the 50 states, each of the 50 states, and every person, man, woman, and child in them. And it is a form of idolatry of the state. And the left has it wrong, and the right has it wrong, because both the conservatives and the liberals, the Democrats and the Republicans are fascistic. It is. I don't know why it seems to me a very plain thing to say that, but it is plain. And so it's one thing to complain about fascism. It's one thing to protest about it. It's one thing, as Mayor Burke says, to take action. And Mayor Andy Burke, in his press release over the weekend, said that you should take action. You should support the NAACP. You should improve lives with the Urban League. You should improve lives through the Islamic Center, and you should respond to action by going to the Southern Poverty Law Center and read his 10 ways to fight hate. Well, listen, you're not going to do anything of any value if your goal is to fight hate. If your goal is to suppress white supremacy, if that's what you're talking about and that's what you're busy about, you're doing absolutely nothing. And in fact, you are being played in a kind of cultural civil war narrative, and that's something I think you need to realize. If you're playing on either side, whether the Southern Confederate side, the heritage side of the veterans of the Sons of Confederate Veterans on one side, and the cultural conservatives, the Christian conservatives on the libertarian side, that's where I would be. Sovereignty for the South, states' rights, and so on. Or on the other side, you have your socialists, your fascists, and your socialist progressives, and your queer Democrats. That's a false narrative. That does not work. That just simply makes the problem worse. Charles Hugh Smith, in a neat little piece on this question, he says, in a healthy society, these fringe pools of self-reinforcing fanaticism are given their proper place. They are outliers representing self-reinforcing black holes of confirmation bias of a few. So in other words, in these disputes, which are always there, they're left on the outside. They're on the margins. Now they've been brought thanks to Charlottesville, they've been brought to the center stage. And the people who are trying to distract you, my listener, from these real issues, right, real reform, I would say using God's law, right, using God's word, using God's grace. Don't do that. Don't use God's grace. Don't talk about those things. Those things take too long, right? You've got to be like the Minutemen. You need to get this big church involved in the fight for life. Get this big church involved in defending marriage. Get this big church in Ohio involved in helping the poor, right? Do it by threats. Do it by making them feel bad. Do it by protest. Write letters to the editor. Condemn these people. One Christian laughing at the other in public, saying you've not done your job. Those things are not really productive. I'm afraid they're not productive. How do we avoid simply condemning someone or simply laughing at someone? How do we avoid just being part of what is effectively a hysteria? Why do we have these things claiming our attention and other things are not claiming our attention? And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here on my program, the David Tulis Show, is to show you that there, or at least not, don't have time to show you. Okay, all I can really do is to suggest that there are alternatives. And if I do my job well, I make it clear what those alternatives are, enough to stand on, at least enough to think upon, right? To think upon these things as alternatives. I think it's one thing to say we should be against the Confederacy, and I think let me back up what I'm trying to say here. I think I have a sympathy for Mayor Burke and his virtue signaling about the cemetery. Okay, I understand why he's doing that. He kind of has to do that to be consistent with his other ideals as a liberal and a Democrat, and he does have ambitions for higher office. So this is something that it's a small step. It's a very small thing, but it's not. Let me say that if Mayor Burke really cares about police reform, and is going to be following up with his chief of police, the man he's named David Roddy, if he really follows up with that and supervises from the top down, because the policing is highly political. Policing is a political act. It is a political act of the state against the people. It's not peacekeeping. It's law enforcement. It is a political function, enforcing the laws against the people, and often the enforcement is on laws that don't apply to people, and that's another topic for another day. But it is political because it is using force to accomplish a kind of marketing end, to make people think a certain thing about the state and its authority. It's actually much less than the police want you to think. Or it's much less. However, if he makes reforms in that department according to his best thinking, then that is worth far more to you, my listener, and that is worth far more to Chattanoogans as a whole than what some would say is his mistake on bringing up the race card and playing the virtuous white man with his discussions with Wade Hinton, the city attorney. So in other words, in terms of the two, in the proportion, the cemetery is a bit of marketing for himself as a liberal. But if he's a genuine liberal and a classical liberal in my sense of the word, if he's like me, then he will make steps that are consistent with his speech that he made on the Friday in which I was banned from being there at the Police Services Center. And if that's what's important. You see what I'm saying? It's more important that the mayor follow through on that kind of discussion than that he be condemned with 17 virulent letters at Chattanooga.com. Those letters, many of them are right. Many of them are right about what they say about Mayor Burke. But on the other hand, I'd say that, I would much rather the mayor ignore the heat from that and focus on the real work of mercy and the real work of keeping peace and the real work of ending police abuse in Chattanooga of the black man. The black man has been suffering in Chattanooga for decades. As Anthony Byrd, the city councilman, will tell you, he has been arrested and stopped by police 30, 40, 50 times. And here he is, Anthony Byrd, a city councilman, with his good nature. I mean, the thing is that he's not bitter about the abuse he has suffered at the hands of police all of his young life. And he's a black man, right? Anthony Byrd is a black man. He is remarkably resigned to what he has had to endure. I've not had to endure that. I'm a Caucasian. I've not had to endure it, and yet he has. And there he is on the city council. So I'd say that Anthony Byrd, and I would say that Demetrius Coonrod are kind of blessings in disguise on the city council. They are the people who have the perspective that I'm trying to propose to you, my listener. I want you, my listener, to think of those two. Though Mrs. Coonrod has had run-ins with the law in the past, she's repented of all of her past mistakes, all of her past sins, as far as I know. And she has an honorable position on the city council, and she maintains a job and is trying to earn a living on the side since you can't make a living as a city council member. She is a picture of grace of Chattanooga. That's what I think about her. Those two are a picture of God's grace upon Chattanooga. And so what we have to hope for from them is they will look out for the interests of their own people. And that is to say, not just blacks, but common people who are innocent of any sin or any crime. And that would be people like you and people like me. And we should not be approached by an officer in an enforcement capacity unless that officer has a warrant for our arrest, has seen us commit a crime, or has a warrant to search our car or our person or our property. That is the only time an officer should act as against a citizen. He should not touch a citizen. He should not accuse a citizen. He should not stop a citizen or arrest anybody unless he is allowed to by law. There needs to be a high respect on the constraint that the law imposes upon the use of force by the state through the police department. Okay, well, let me just mention here about that whole question. And this is the Chattanooga versus Davis issue. Now, whenever I touch this point, it takes up my whole segment. I don't really want to do that. But Basil Marceau is a candidate for governor. Again, he will be. And he and I've had many long conversations with Basil Marceau, whom I'm having a hard time understanding him entirely. But he is making the argument that, and he has court cases that suggest he's got a point, that Chattanooga does not have authority to run a police department at all that does anything beyond serving papers, and that's it. That it has only process server authority, and nothing more. That is a remarkable assertion. But you will not have heard about it anywhere except at my website. That is to say, Nooganomics.com, the website for the man who matters. There is something insightful in this very important Chattanooga case. There are two of them, Chattanooga versus Davis, Chattanooga versus Myers, from about 10 years before. And they say that cities do not have enforcement authority. They have civil authority only. If that's the case, then what is Chattanooga doing with a police department to begin with? How does that police department have any authority at all? Now, I haven't gotten to that issue yet. I have pending a story on unmarked police cars doing traffic. That is the story I'm working on. And I was delivered by Rob Simmons and the city attorney's office a very small folder. I'm afraid how small it is, answering my open records request questions about that issue. And I haven't quite gotten into that yet, but I'm trying to develop what the legal argument is against unmarked cars plying the traffic enforcement trade. Right? Traffic is in transportation. And yet we find routinely that traffic statutes are applied against private parties who mistakenly think they're in commerce who mistakenly think that they're operators and drivers in commerce, in transportation. And we have been following the most important court case in 80 years in Tennessee, and that is one not mentioned anywhere in the press except from me, right? I'm the only reporter that's covered that case. That's on appeal now with the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals, and a second case is started with the same issues in Lawrence County, Tennessee, and that is the right of travel on the public right-of-way as opposed to the right of state regulatory authority over commerce only, right? The state can regulate commerce, but it has no authority to regulate the free exercise of a First Amendment or a constitutional amendment, a constitutional right of travel, a constitutionally guaranteed, God-given right of travel. It's a property right that has been facing duress. All right, the question again about protest, and Richard Spencer from the alt-right, I just wanted to mention, and I'm not going to have time to develop this, but he does not, he's not pro-life, and the so-called, he is the, they say he's a hate monger. He's a writer and a thinker, but he's not pro-life, and the reason he's not pro-life, because get this, black children are born, right? So if Mayor Burke says he's against racism, then how come he's not for the right of life of every black child? Let him be only for the lives of black children who are unborn. Let him be only for them. That's good enough for me. If he says, I insist on the right of every black boy and girl to be born and not to be destroyed in utero, I'll be happy with that. I won't criticize him. I won't say, hey, what about white children? I will not say that, I promise. I will not say that. I will let you defend black children who are not yet born, who are in utero, right? Who are growing in their distinct genetic identity from mom or dad, to be built, to be knit together there in the womb. Spencer says that rights are collective and not private and not personal. That of course allows him to accept abortion and accept the Margaret Sanger war against the black man. She thought blacks were useless eaters and should be reduced in their number so that they might just at best perhaps be the hired help. But Richard Spencer says smart people are using abortion when you have a situation like Down syndrome, or you have a situation where the health of the mother is at risk. I would say that is the unintelligent and blacks and Hispanics who use abortion as birth control, as a kind of late-term birth control. He says that contraception has been a great detriment because precisely the people who shouldn't be using it are using it. That's to say whites. We want smart people to have more children. I sometimes want smart people to be a little more reckless. Don't plan. Don't use a condom. What I'm basically saying is the abortion issue is just a much more complicated issue than this kind of good and evil binary that the pro-life movement and the Christian movement wants to use. We need to have more. We need to be more adult than they are. And then he says, he says that we want to be a movement about families, about life in a deep sense, not just rights, but truly a great life and greatness and beautiful, flourishing, productive families. We want to be eugenic in the deepest sense of the word. Pro-lifers want to be radically dysgenic, egalitarian, multiracial, human rights thumpers, and they're not us. In other words, if you're pro-life, you want every child to be born, even blacks. And so if you're pro-life, you're not good enough for the alt-right. And this notable writer, Richard Spencer, who's supporting this line of thinking. David Tulis, I do thank you for giving me just a couple minutes of your time. Thank you.
The Tennessee Valley's news, talk, and sports leader.